So, where did Augustine get this tenet of original sin? We will now directly test the claim of his rival, Julian, that Augustine, in his final doctrine of sin, had imported Manichaean views into the Catholic faith. Let's take a look at that idea. Okay, Manichaeism. What is Manichaeism? We might want to address that first. Who are these Manichaeans with whom Augustine studied for 10 years before his conversion to Christianity? Well, like other Gnosticizing groups, Manichaeans taught a highly developed dualistic worldview. They emphasized the continuous battle between spiritual good and material evil. In the Manichaean view, sex and procreation were negative activities which only trapped divine souls in the bondage of hereditary corruption. Indeed, humanity, in their view, was polluted with evil from birth. Sexual desire is a byproduct of this evil, and its exercise only perpetuates an evil cycle. Sex is an evil act, and the human will is enslaved to evil, which compels all of us towards sin, even against our deepest wishes. The Manichaean teaching on sex and the lenient treatment of Manichaean disciples with regard to sexual sin must have appealed to Augustine, who famously struggled with sexual sin. In his celebrated book, The Confessions, we find, as one scholar reveals, that sexual desire played a central role in Augustine's life. He referred to himself prior to his conversion to Catholic Christianity as a slave to lust. He represented his conversion as a commitment to continence, the female personification of sexual renunciation. Nevertheless, he experienced an ongoing struggle with his sexual passions long after his conversion. It's not difficult to imagine how liberating the Manichaean doctrine of sin must have been for the young Augustine. He admits that in his own struggle with sin, he did not want to think that he himself was responsible for his failure. He did not want to think that it was his fault. No, there must be some evil force controlling him or forcing him to do these things. And the Manichaeans told Augustine that he need not be too disappointed in himself. They explained that his situation was the fault of his material state. And so, drawn to these ideas and to others, Augustine spent a decade as a Manichaean disciple. And after being a Manichaean for 10 years, Augustine was finally persuaded by the Catholics, and he converted. He was finally baptized as a Christian, as an Orthodox Christian, by Ambrose. And thanks to his intelligence and his speaking ability, he was soon elected bishop and quickly began to exert massive influence over the Western Church. Now, it is of the utmost importance to note that when Augustine first converted to Christianity, he initially abandoned his Manichaean views on the will. And he took up the traditional Catholic views on free will. Why did he do this? Well, obviously because this is what he learned from his Christian teachers upon converting. Prior to 412, Augustine did not yet think that man's hereditary stain included the bondage of the will. As a Catholic convert, he initially stood strong against his Gnostic opponents and against his former Manichaean brothers, who were all arguing, as he himself once had, that man was incapable of choosing God and requires God's radical grace to unilaterally save him. Again, the Manichaeans, like other Gnostics, famously used the writings of Paul to argue their views. Yes, the Manichaeans used the writings of Paul. And Augustine, as a new Catholic convert, would have initially resisted such interpretations of Paul. However, we know from his writings that after much debate, and only after much debate with the Manichaeans, Augustine finally abandoned the traditional Catholic position on these points. According to his own testimony, he gave up on traditional free will and reverted back to his earlier stance on this point that he had held as a Manichaean. And he ultimately writes in his retractions of his earlier works, "I have tried hard to maintain the free choice of the human will, but the grace of God prevailed." Augustine's Christian opponents, like Julian and his allies, perceived that Augustine, with this move, had only brought Manichaean concerns in with him when he converted. But as good historians, we must ultimately ask whether we agree with the basic charge of Julian that Augustine was a Manichaean in regard to his doctrine of sin. Is that true? Obviously, Augustine rejected that idea, but let's see. Well, there clearly were many differences between Augustine and the Manichaeans. For example, for Manichaeans, there had been no historical fall which corrupted human flesh and changed some of its properties. Rather, the material world was inherently evil. Good and evil were eternal and diametrically opposed principles. And Augustine loved to point out his differences with the Manichaeans on these points. Nevertheless, despite their disagreement on the origin of evil, their significant agreement on the effects of evil on the human will are ultimately unavoidable. When we return to the constituent claims of Augustine's doctrine, we find that Manichaeism offers the most robust and direct source for the principles which Augustine demonstrably did not gain from his Catholic tradition. Indeed, the Western teachers who first welcomed him into Christianity had already been influenced by the Encretite tradition, but they had modified Encretite tradition so they could still teach the freedom of the will, they could still have positive views about marriage and things like that. So Augustine's teachers could teach him all of the propositions here except propositions D, E, and G. So these propositions D, E, and G, well, these are the Encretite and Gnostic propositions which the Western fathers who had taught Augustine had already purged and cleansed. However, we must deal with the fact, as Jason David Bedune reveals, that during his Christian career, Augustine rapidly and inexplicably shifted to a position much closer to that held by the Manichaeans, hardening and reifying mere habit into something fundamentally disintegrative to human moral agency. So I will now argue that since Augustine did not inherit such teaching from the Catholics, he is found to have inherited it from the Manichaeans. And I argue this on the basis of the fact that A, Augustine initially abandoned such thinking upon conversion from Manichaeism to Christianity, and B, that Augustine changed his mind about free will and reverted to the Manichaean view and their Pauline justification for it only after re-engaging with the Manichaeans in very serious debate on this topic. Indeed, Augustine admits that he had tried very hard to hold on to the Catholic doctrine of the freedom of the will, but he was unable to. And this change took place only after his new Catholic beliefs were severely tested in debates with his former Manichaean brothers. And so in this light, Julian of Acclaim's charge of importation, when we narrow it down to the area of sin's effects on free will, it appears to stand. Augustine imported views about sin's effects on free will from his Manichaean past. And it's clear to me that Augustine made room for Manichaean concerns by abandoning the specific reading of Paul that he had been given by the Catholics. But it is not true, let me point this out, it is not true, as some say, that Augustine invented original sin out of thin air. The constituent claims of Augustine's doctrine had existed long before. But his doctrine was innovative in how it stitched Gnostic, Manichaean, and Catholic claims together in a coherent system that was neither entirely Catholic nor Manichaean. But how is it that so many Christians in the West came to accept this sort of doctrine? Well, there are many, many reasons why original sin won in the West. We could point to Augustine's eloquence, or to the political lobbying of his allies with the popes and the emperors, which happened, or to the marriage of church and state under Constantine and the changing socio-political context and the needs of Christians. We could speak all night about these things, but I will speak only to very one simple reason for the sake of time. For many Christians, Augustine's doctrine was simply more appealing than the earlier tradition. Practically speaking, Augustine's doctrine essentially made living with sin easier.